Well, howdy everyone, and today I have something a little unusual for you. I found an old copy of the Tokina Fisheye 10 to 17mm f3.5 to 4.5 DX. This lens is actually the result of a collaboration between Tokina and Pentax all the way back in 2007, so it's a pretty old piece of kit now. A zoomable fisheye lens is certainly a bizarre and rare specimen. It reminds me of Canon's much newer 8 to 15mm L lens, except it obviously can't give the same wide angle, and also you can find the older Tokina lens for about a third of the price. Oddly enough, this lens was originally intended just for APS-C cameras, as you can see written on the box here, which isn't really surprising because back in those days, virtually all digital SLR cameras had the smaller APS-C sized sensors inside them. The idea of this lens was that you could get your classic fisheye shots at 10mm, but also zoom into 17mm for a closer field of view, albeit simply with a very heavy barrel distortion rather than a full fisheye effect. Although why anyone would want a 17mm picture with heavy distortion is beyond me. You can see the projection difference on an APS-C camera here. Anyway, when I was testing the lens, I was pleasantly surprised to find that the zoom feature means that it also offers 100% coverage on a full frame camera too, if you zoom in, as you can see here. In fact, even just at 15mm, you'll get the full fisheye effect. So it turns out this Tokina lens is far more useful nowadays than it was probably originally intended. It can happily project a full fisheye image on whatever camera sensor you have behind it, full frame or APS-C. Neat. If only it went a bit wider than 10mm, then you might be able to get a fully circular image on full frame if you hacked off the lens hood. In fact, Tokina still sell this lens in a version without the metal hood, specifying that it's suitable for full frame cameras. But even with a new version, you won't be able to get wide enough for a fully circular image. Well, anyway, let's have a look at its build quality. The lens's body is a combination of plastic and metal parts with rubberized zoom and focus rings. It's rather an ugly lens, but it certainly feels very solid. My copy of it has clearly been put through some extensive use and abuse over the years, as you can probably see, but it's still working just fine. The zoom ring works smoothly enough, but not very evenly. And unlike Tokina's usual push-pull focus system, we see here a conventional, old-style focus switch for changing between manual and autofocus. In autofocus mode, the focus ring stops. Don't try to force it around. The autofocus motor makes a little noise, but it works fairly quickly and reasonably accurately. The lens comes with a nice metal lens cap which fits on snugly. Overall, its design is a bit grimly functional, but functional is good, and it's clearly built strongly enough to last well past the point when the apes take over the world. Let's have a look at picture quality then. My usual test chart won't really work with a fisheye lens, so here's an aerial view instead. We'll start with the results on an APS-C camera, seeing as it was originally intended for APS-C. It's designed for digital SLR cameras, but I've adapted it for my 24MP Canon EOS M3 here. Quite a challenging camera sensor, but adapting it for mirrorless won't affect the picture quality. At 10mm and f3.5, the lens is reasonably sharp in the middle of the image, but we're not seeing a huge amount of detail here. Let's see about the corners. Well, the good news is that there's not much corner shading or vignetting, and there's a reasonable amount of detail at f3.5, but we also see some appallingly bad chromatic aberration, green and purple, with especially strong purple fringing. Stop down to f5.6 and there's barely any improvement, really, apart from a touch more brightness, but back in the middle of the image, we see excellent sharpness and detail. f8 is also very good. Stop down to f11 though, and on a 24MP sensor we're beginning to see a slightly softer picture due to the effects of diffraction. The corners of the image haven't seen any improvement by this stage, really. Stopping down any further just brings more softness. So at the crucial 10mm focal length, the lens is capable of great sharpness in the middle of the image, but not so much detail in the corners, and nuclear wasteland levels of chromatic aberration. Not uncommon for a Tokina lens, I have to say. Let's zoom into 17mm then. At f4.5, sharpness is quite good in the middle of the image, with just a touch of ghosting. The corners of the image are very soft though, and still with quite strong chromatic aberration. Stop down to f5.6 and then to f8 for increasing sharpness, although the colour fringing doesn't go away. Back in the middle, the image is very sharp indeed now. If you stop down further than this, then of course the image will get progressively softer. So a weaker performance at 17mm. Alright, let's take a look at the performance on a full frame camera now, a 20 megapixel Canon 6D. At 15mm, the ideal focal length for a full fisheye image, the maximum aperture is f4. In the middle of the image, sharpness is good but not great. The corners of the image are pretty soft, again with strong chromatic aberration. Stop down to f5.6 for a bit more clarity and a little more brightness in those corners, and the middle of the image is now very sharp. At f8 there's even a touch more sharpness, but those corners still leave a lot to be desired. And that's as sharp as things get on this lens, even if you stop down the aperture more. So on a full frame camera, the Tokina is giving a somewhat mediocre performance, although you can get reasonably clear pictures, especially if you stop down to about f8. Let's see now about close-up image quality. The lens can focus down to about 14cm, giving you potentially some pretty interesting pictures. Close-up image quality is okay at f3.5, acceptably sharp with a little colour fringing. Stop down to f5.6 for a sharper and cleaner image. Well, let's see how well this optic works against bright lights, a very important question for such an ultra-wide-angle lens. It's a pretty good performance actually. We see minimal flaring and minimal loss of contrast. Let's see now about the lens's bokeh, or the quality of its out-of-focus backgrounds. If you get close to your subject, it is quite possible to get some background separation, particularly if you're using a full frame camera. Unusually for a Tokina lens, those backgrounds look lovely and smooth, so the lens gets a bonus point there. At the end of the day, the Tokina 10-17 is really quite a weird lens, and its multiple quirks are enough to give any reviewer a headache. Its build quality is a bit ugly, but undoubtedly quite rugged and functional. Its picture quality can be quite sharp in the middle of your images, but a bit soft in the corners, with unfortunate and alarming levels of chromatic aberration. And then there's the weird zoom function. It's helpful if you own both APS-C and full frame cameras, like I do, and you want one lens to cover them both. Otherwise though, the zoom function is pretty redundant. There's no real need for the heavily distorted 17mm option if you're using an APS-C camera, and the lens is a bit soft at that point anyway. There are better options out there, simpler fisheye lenses with less chromatic aberration for full frame or APS-C cameras, like the Samyang 8mm or 12mm, my personal favourite fisheye lenses. But at the end of the day, the Tokina lens is still capable of getting you some very nice images with good detail, despite all its crazy quirks, so if you can find one somewhere for a bargain price, it could be worth getting.